Hi, everyone. It's Miss Mary. We're on day 6. We're on chapter 13, boarding school. By the time I finished public elementary school in Lodgegrass, racial tension was at its worst out here. So very few Indian children attended Lodgegrass High School. They would go off reservation boarding schools, which had improved a lot since the early days. They weren't perfect, but they were better than having to deal with white kids at the public schools. The only Crow students at Lodgegrass High School at that time were two basketball players, my uncle Tom Yellowtail and Pete Left Hand. At this, it was in a town in the middle of the Crow reservation. Well, I was sick of fighting every day, so I told my family that I wanted to go away to school. We went to Crow Agency, the headquarters of the Crow Reservation, and I would put my application with the government education official there. He sent my application to a school in South Dakota, Flandreau Indian School. We waited and waited. Finally, just before school was to open in the fall, word came that Flandreau didn't have room for me. I was disappointed and didn't know what to do. It was getting too late to apply for somewhere else. Luckily, the Reverend W.A. Petzold of the Baptist Mission at Lodgegrass heard about my problem and he offered to help. I can send you to Pacone. He said Pacone is a Baptist supported Indian school in Oklahoma, and he said I'll send some other Crow children too. As it turned out, quite a few of us, about 15 from Lodgegrass and one or two from the other districts of our reservation, went to Pacone that year. This was 1929, and I was 16 years old. At Pacone, I entered 8th grade. Wallace Iron was also in the 8th grade. Going to Pacone was a real eye opener for me. The students there were from 30 to 40 different Indian tribes across the country. Until then, my knowledge of other Indians were only of the Cheyenne, Pagans, and Sioux who lived near us. It was meeting the kids from other tribes that got me interested in collecting Crow stories because the kids from other tribes would ask about my tribe. By then, my English was pretty good, but I still preferred speaking Crow when I could. I went back the next year and kept going back. I finished 1934 in junior college in 1936. During my years at Bacone, I participated in everything. I sang in the bass section of a men's singing group called the Redman Glee Club. Every spring we could go on tour. We performed in Texas, Kansas, Missouri, and Florida. We performed at the 1932 World's Fair in Chicago. I also took saxophone and was a member of the football pep band and school orchestra. I also participated in what athletics were available at Bacone. I played basketball 2 years in high school and 2 years in junior college, and I boxed when I was a freshman. Boxing was a big thing at Bacone, but after a couple fights, I quit. I got hit between the eyes and had a headache for a week. I took part in track activities. I especially liked throwing the javelin. I was also a pitcher on the high school baseball team. For 3 summers, my senior year in high school and my 2 years in junior college, I worked at an Eastern Boys Camp. 1 summer in New Hampshire and 2 summers in New Jersey. I was an instructor in Indian crafts and lore. In New Hampshire, I learned how to paddle a canoe. I had never seen a canoe before. I also learned how to shoot a bow and arrow at camp. After the kids went to their cabins for the evening, I would slip over to the archery range and practice. As far as schoolwork was concerned, I did well except for freshman algebra, but Wallace Iron was a pretty good student. He did quite well in algebra and he would coach me along. In a little while, I caught on, began to complete each other, only in algebra but in other subjects as well. Right from the 9th grade, I started earning good grades, but Wallace quit high school after his freshman year and others dropped out too until I was the only Crow there. Even alone, I held my own. Every year at Bacone, I made the Oklahoma High School honor roll. I did well in junior college also. I majored in science and took courses like botany, biology, and geology. When I graduated from Bacone Junior College in 1936, I was pretty high up in my class. When I returned to the reservation that summer, Dr. Petzold said, How about going on to Linfield College? I'll get you some money. Linfield College is in Oregon. Like Bacone, it is affiliated with the Baptist Church. I enrolled there as a junior and graduated 2 years later, June 30th, 1938. I was the first Crow Indian to graduate from college. The first Crow woman was Joy Yellowtail, who graduated from college in California in 1937. When I was leaving to attend Linfield College in August of 1936, my Cheyenne grandmother, Walking Woman, was staying with my parents. As I was putting my suitcase in the car just before sunrise, Walking Woman heard the activity and woke up. She came outside and asked where I was going. My mother told me that I was going away to college in Oregon. The old woman stood there and looked at me as intently for a while. Then she stepped forward and turned me around to face east. As I stood there looking across the Little Bighorn River in the horizon, she burst into song. It was a wailing type of song that I had never heard before, but it is something that the Cheyenne and Sioux do. I do not know if she was singing or crying. It was kind of a mixture at the end of the song. She gave the Cheyenne woman's trill, then she pushed me and said, "Go." This is a traditional way Cheyenne women had sent their husbands and sons off to the warpath in the old intertribal war days. I can still hear her voice in the day. At Linfield, things could get pretty tough, and I was ready to quit many times. I had a hard time with accounting. Genetics was rough too, but then I would remember my Cheyenne grandmother sending me off to war. I would remember that and I would try again. That memory kept me going through all my school days, and it gave me encouragement during the Second World War when I was an infantryman in Germany. I could almost feel the dear old lady singing and crying like the day it happened. Chapter 14, Strong Medicine. The warrior tradition of the Crow people occupied my thoughts when I inducted into the Army in Fort Douglas, Utah in 1942 after graduating from Linfield College. I had enrolled in the University of Southern California to study anthropology, but now Uncle Sam needed me. So instead of finishing my studies, I found myself standing in a long line of inductees waiting for my physical exam. After the physical, I had to go into another room to be interviewed about my work experience so that the Army could figure out the best way to use me. I entered the room and was amazed to see one of the officials interviewing the inductees was Jerry Nicholson, who had been my roommate at Linfield College. We were so poor in those days that we had rented a small room and slept together in one bed. When Jerry spotted me, he motioned me to follow him. We went into his office, he shut the door, and we had a good reunion before we got down to business. With your education, he told me, I can get you a commission. Thanks a lot, Jerry, but I don't want to start out as an officer. I was going to do like my grandfather, Medicine Crow. My grandfather started his military career as a young man, working his way up through the Crow warrior ranks and became a great chief. I am going to follow in his footsteps. It was the biggest mistakes I ever made because the U.S. Army did not work on the principles of the Crow tribe. I entered the Army as a private and came out a private. I never got another chance to be an officer. In fact, at first I wasn't even a combat soldier. The Army assigned me to be a clerk, a paper pusher, and that is how I spent my first couple years on active duty. All that changed in the closing months of World War II. The Army needed foot soldiers for the invasion of Germany, and I was one of those moved to the front lines. Here finally was my opportunity to be a warrior, to meet the enemy in the combat, but in truth, I knew little about being a warrior, only the stories I had heard growing up. In the pre-reservation days, a young Crow man aspiring to be a warrior would go into the Wolf Teeth Mountains seeking Baxay or spiritual power. He believed that the power would make him a better warrior, making him more successful in performing war deeds, and helping eventually to become a chief with great wealth, high prestige, and large following. The Crow called his spiritual experience going without water. Over 3 or 4 days of fasting, the young man hoped to receive a visit by animal spirits who were emissaries of the first maker or great spirit. Sometimes the vision seeker would cut off a finger, adding to the pain of the blood sacrificed to his pangs of hunger and thirst. The ordeal was voluntary, and not all young men believed they needed a personal vision experience to be a successful warrior. Some preferred to go directly to a veteran warrior or a spiritual leader and get his blessing. Having been raised Christian, I never attempted a traditional vision quest. I preferred to do my communicating with the first maker in church, but I still believed in the traditional sources of spiritual power. During my tour of duty in Germany, I always carried with me a special feather that had belonged to a Shoshone Sundance chief from Fort Washaki. He had given it to my Uncle Tom Yellowtail. It was a little fluffy snow white eagle feather. Before a battle, I would put the feather inside my helmet. In addition to carrying the feather, I recited certain prayers and painted myself with red lightning streak and a red ring. I did not put the paint on my face, but on my arms under my shirt. My uncle taught me how to paint myself properly. If I did not have paint, I could use a red pencil. That worked as well as paint. When I was under fire, I felt much better because of my spiritual medicine. To this day, I credit my medicine for saving my life during those close encounters with the Germans. One such encounter occurred when my company came under artillery and mortar fire when we were marching on the side of a narrow valley. The Germans were directly across from us. We were sitting ducks, but I felt pretty well prepared. My knapsack was full of pemmican, a special treat of pounded meat that my mother had sent me. I had my rifle, I had the painted symbols on my arms, and I had put the medicine feather in my helmet. Suddenly, everything went black. An artillery shell had exploded right in the front of me. It killed or wounded about half a dozen of the soldiers nearest me. The blast knocked me right over the side of the cliff that we were walking on. The hillside was steep and covered with trees and rocks. I could hear guys moaning all around me. Miraculously, I was not hurt, but just bruised a bit. But my helmet was gone. My medicine feather was gone. My knapsack with pemmican was gone. My rifle was gone. I felt helpless. I was in shock. It was nighttime and the hill was so steep I couldn't walk. I had to crawl out of there. I began pulling myself up the hill by grabbing one tree after another. First, I found my rifle. A little farther up the hill, I found my knapsack. Nearly the last tree at the top of the hill, I found my helmet with the feather still tucked in the liner. When I put the helmet back on, I came to my senses. Everything was now all right, but I admit I had panicked for a while. I had always attributed the particular sequence of good luck to my special Indian medicine. Whenever I had a close call, I would think about that medicine. After I returned from war, I gave that feather to one of my cousins, Henry Old Coyote. He was a machine gunner on a B-25. That feather went with him to Africa, Germany, and Italy. I think after the Second World War, that feather went to Korea with a Crow soldier. It might have even gone to Vietnam. I don't know where it is now, but it certainly was powerful. Chapter 15. Naturally, I thought about the famous warriors when I went to Germany. I had the legacy to live up to. My goal was to be a good soldier, to perform honorably in combat if the occasion occurred. I did not think in terms of counting coup. Those days were gone, I believe, but when I returned from Germany and the elders asked me and the other Crow veterans to tell our war stories, lo and behold, I completed the 4 requirements to become a chief. I accomplished my first coup when the Allies, United States, France, and Great Britain started the big push into Germany from France. I was a private in Company K, 411th Infantry, 103rd Division, known as the Cactus Division, a Texas outfit. I was the only Indian in my company. It was January and the ground was covered with snow. The boundary that separated the two countries at that point was a little creek about the size of Lodge Grass Creek running through a canyon. It was a pretty deep canyon with steep walls. It was not rocky like our canyons in Montana, but it had real sharp hills. That was the border. The French line with its big guns was behind us. On the other side of the creek facing us were the big guns of the German line. While we went down the hill on the French side, crossed over into Germany, and started toward the Siegfried line. By now it was late afternoon. Before long, we ran into foxholes just loaded with Germans. Then the fight started. After about an hour of fighting, it got dark, but we pushed forward. The Germans slowly withdrew upon the side of the hill toward their big guns. As they retreated, we discovered a network of trenches higher than our heads and about 3 or 4 feet wide, going every which way. We took the main trench and followed it to the top of the hill, but it was rough going. The path was kind of steep, slushy, and muddy. By the time I got to the top, the 30 or 40 of our boys had gone ahead of me, had made the ground even more sloppy and slippery. To make matters worse, the guy in front of me was fat, clumsy kid. He was always slipping and falling. When we finally reached the crest of the hill, he couldn't make it up the top. He'd get there almost to the top and then slide down. Finally, I managed to push him up and over. Just then, the Germans opened fire and he came sliding back down and landed on top of me. I think that is the only reason I didn't get killed that day. All the guys who had gotten on top were wiped out. The rest of us scattered. We went back down the hill until the side trenches. The next day, someone made the decision to blow up the pillboxes, large concrete bunkers with big guns where the Germans were hiding. As luck would have it, I was standing next to the commanding officer when the order came over the phone. The message said to send some men back up the hill on the French side to get boxes of dynamite needed to blow up the pillboxes. The CO said, "Well, Chief," he always called me Chief, "I guess if anybody can go through, you can. Get 6 men and go up there." Boy, it was a high hill loaded with landmines, hidden bombs that would go off if you stepped on them. Before I could ask for volunteers, my closest buddy stepped in and said, "Let's go, Chief." And all 6 guys, my closest friends, went with me. I was glad only 6 came forward because that had made 7 of us, and seven is one of those numbers Indians consider lucky. Before we left, the company commander ordered a smoke screen. "We can't afford to let these guys go in plain sight," he said. So guns from the American side began throwing smoke screen shells on the hill to give us cover. Pretty soon, that whole hillside was covered with a mass of white smoke. Then we took off. Meanwhile, the Germans realized something was happening, so they began lobbing mortar shells in our direction. We finally made it, but took a long time crawling up that hill. It was steep and slippery with wet snow, but at least did not set off any landmines or get hit by any mortar shells. Anyhow, we finally got up there to the French side. The mess tent was still up, and so was the communication center. We were given some hot soup and coffee, but not much time to rest. Maybe a half hour before they told us to take off again. They gave us boxes of dynamite with fuses. Each box weighed 50 pounds. We tried putting them on our shoulders, but the edges cut into our shoulders. We couldn't walk down the hill carrying them in both hands. They were just too clumsy to handle. I didn't know what to do at first, and just sat down, set my box on my knees, and started sliding down the hill. The other guys saw me and did the same thing. Here we were, sliding behind one another down the hill. It wasn't fast, but we made it. Our boys had thrown some more smoke shells on the hillside to keep it foggy, but the Germans were lobbing mortar shells and hand grenades too. If our boxes had gotten hit, we would have stepped on a mine. We would have been goners. It was a terrifying experience, but somehow we came back without a scratch, and with 7 boxes of dynamite. The engineers then went ahead and blew up the 2 or 3 of those pillboxes. When later I told this story to the elders, they told me it was the same as leading a war party in the days. I had been assigned to a command job. We had returned safely and victoriously. We hadn't come back with horses or scalps, but we had returned with materials essential to the welfare of our men. That was the first war deed. The next war deed was counting coup on a German soldier. After attacking the line, we were sent back to France for a couple of months of rest. Then in March 1944, our unit went back into Germany. Soon after crossing the border, we came into a little town. Our assignment was to enter the town from the rear while other units attacked straight on. Boy, it was cold. There was still snow on the ground. To approach the town, we had to wade through a slough up to our chests. I tell you, it was wet and it was cold, but it was the safest way to get into town because the Germans had planted landmines all over. Because the Germans never expected anyone to come from that direction, we entered without them noticing us. In the meantime, our boys had gotten through the landmines and had started hitting the other side of the town. I had about 5 to 6 soldiers assigned to me. We were told to secure a particular back alley. Although there was a lot of gunfire in the main street, the back alley where I was going was kind of quiet. With my platoon right behind me, I began running down the alley. I was carrying a M1 rifle. Along one side of the alley was a stone wall that was about 10 feet high. As I was running, I could see a gate. So I headed for it. I wanted to see what was happening on the main street. A German soldier had the same idea, it turned out. He was running toward the gate too, but from the other side of the wall. With all the shooting going on, I could not hear him. He could not hear me either. We met at the gate. My reactions were a bit quicker than his. I hit him under the chin with the butt of the rifle and knocked him down, sending his rifle flying. He tried to reach for his rifle, but I kicked it out of the way. I dropped my gun and jumped on the top of him and put my hands on and around his throat. Meanwhile, the rest of my Meanwhile, the rest of my guys had caught up. They wanted to shoot the German, but I still had my hands on his throat. Too scared, he began hollering, Hitler, 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 which meant Hitler's dead, Hitler's dead, Hitler no good. He was crying. Tears were running down his face. I felt so sorry for him, I let him go. Capturing that German counted for 2 war deeds. He was the first German he ran into the day, and by knocking him down and touching him, and I counted coup on him. I had also taken his weapon away from him, which was another coup. Even though I wasn't thinking about counting coup, I had been looking for a chance to capture a horse. To me, that was the best thing I could do to prove I was worthy of the ancestors. The war was almost over before I got my chance at the German horse. We were following a group of Hitler's SS officers who were on horseback, about 50 of them. They had abandoned their men who were surrendering by the thousands. We followed those SS all night. They were riding their horses on an asphalt uh, road, and we could hear the clop, clop, clop of the hooves ahead of us. About midnight, the horsemen left the highway and went to a farm about 3 miles down the road. We followed their trail in the moonlight and arrived at the villa with a barn and a little fenced pasture. As our commanding officer sat down with the platoon leaders to discuss our best to handle the situation, all I could think was about those horses in the corral. The decision was made to attack the farmhouse at daybreak. The next morning, when the CEO finished telling the platoon leaders to take the men this way and that way, I said, Sir, maybe I should get those horses out of the corral before you attack because some of those SSI guys might be able to escape on them. It would only take me about 5 minutes. The CEO looked at me funny for a second, but he probably had an idea of what I was up to. Okay, Chief, you're on. That was all I needed. I took one of my buddies and we began sneaking down to the corral and the barn. We had to be careful in case the German was in the barn on guard duty, watching when we got there. Nothing was moving. The horses were tired, just standing there. I crawled through the corral fence and came up on one of them. I told him, whoa, whoa, in English. He snorted a little bit, but I quickly settled down. I had his rope with me and I used to tie his blanket. I took that rope and I tied his lower jaw with a double half hitch, just like the old time Crow warriors used to do. And then I tried to get on, but it was a tall horse and my boots were so muddy and caked up I had a hard time mounting. Finally, I led the horse to the watering trough and stood on that to get on its back. I told my buddy that I was going to the other end of the paddock behind the horses. And as soon as I got there, I would give a little whistle. When he heard the whistle, he was to open the gate and get out of the way. When I got back there and gave the whistle, then I gave a crow war cry and those horses took off. Those were woods about a half a mile away, so as soon as we cleared the gate, I headed in that direction. But about then, our boys opened fire on the farmhouse. By now, it was coming daylight, and I could get a good look at my horses. I had 40 or 50 head. I was riding a sorrel with the blades, a real nice horse. When we reached the woods and the horses started to mill around, I did something spontaneous. I sang a crow praise song and rode around the horses. They all looked at me. The Germans had surrendered quickly and the firing was over, so I left the horses in the woods except the one I was riding and headed back to the farmhouse. After we had finished mopping things up and sending the prisoners to the rear, the company commander said, let's go, and we took off. There was a gravel railroad bed nearby, which made the walking a little better. As the guys took off down the railroad track, I was still on my horse. It was better to ride than walk. I felt good. I was a Crow warrior. My grandfathers would have been proud of me, I thought, but all too soon, the reality of war came back. After letting me ride the horse for about a mile or so, the CO yelled over to me, Chief, you better get off. You make too good of a target. Chapter 16, High Bird. Okay. I was inducted into the Army March 4th, 1943, and discharged January 10th, 1946. I phoned my parents from Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and said I would arrive in Lodge Grass by train number 41 at 6 p.m. on January 15th. When Crow soldiers came home after serving in World War II, their relatives would stage a welcome at the train station and host a grand reception about a week or two later. When I returned, my train stopped in Sheridan, Wyoming for about 30 minutes, so I ran downtown to have a hamburger feed at Louis'. Louis' could make a dime hamburger taste like a New York cut sirloin. Boy, I sure miss those hamburgers while I was overseas. It was a bad decision, however, because the train left without me. In the meantime, a huge welcome crowd awaited me at Lodge Grass Depot. My mother was ready with a stack of new Pendleton blankets to spread from the train to the singers some 60 feet away. As I stepped off the train, I was supposed to walk along the row of blankets and start dancing as I reached the singers. Well, this didn't take place. A woman on the train from Sheridan informed my mother that I was seen at Louis with a big pile of hamburgers in front of me. Poor mom. She must have been very disappointed. Anyhow, the reception was held that weekend. People gathered in front of the dance hall when I arrived that Saturday afternoon. As I walked into the hall, people along the way shook my hands, relatives hugged me, and admiring girls kissed me. When I stepped into the hall, the drummers sang the war honor song of my grandfather, Chief Medicine Crow. I danced around the floor with my relatives dancing behind me. Several elders who were still familiar with intertribal military traditions requested my recital of war deeds. The request took me unawares of I had never thought about my activities of the battlefield as war deeds except when I captured the horses. But I told the elders about my hand to hand encounter with a German soldier and how I took his gun away from him. Then I related the time I was in charge of the detail of soldiers that went after dynamite so the big guns along the lines could be blasted. And I told them about sneaking into German camp and stealing the horses belonging to the SS soldier officers. For those four coups, I declared a full-fledged Crow war. Of the war deeds, my folks and relatives started the giveaway, which was always done when someone in Crow society is honored. I know in white society, when someone is honored, the person gets presents, but this is not the way it is done in Crow society. When someone succeeds, she gives presents to those who help make that success possible, like parents, relatives, teachers, and friends. My mother gave away a stack of new Pendleton blankets, quilts, and other nice things. And my stepdad, John Whiteman runs him, brought in a fine saddle horse with a new saddle and bridle and gave it away in my honor. The last event of the day was the big feast. At the welcome of home reception, I got a new name. One of my Whistling Water Klansmen ties his knees, and some others got together and talked things over. They said, let's give him Winterman a new name. Let's name him after one of our illustrious whistling watermen. So they gave me his name, Hybrid. Of course, Hybrid had died long before. They also gave me his honor song, and they gave me his right as an announcer or town crier. As my former name, Winterman, shortly after that, we had a dance at Lodge Grass. During the dance, another of my Whistling Water Clans brothers, Ellsworth Little Light, talked to the announcer for a while, and then he called me over. Right now, he said, I'm going to buy your name for my son. His son was Robert Little Light. That's how it works. Someone can buy your name for himself, for his son, or some relative, and you can't refuse. So he took my name, Winterman, and gave it to his son. He gave me several things, some money, a Pendleton blanket, and so forth, so I don't use the name anymore. I still have the name Joe Medicine Crow in my legal name, so in the white world, I'm Joe, but among my Crow people, I am Hybrid. We use our Indian names during dances, ceremonials, powwows, and other tribal events. And it is also the tribal ceremonies that I use my honor song, which my Whistling Water Klansman gave me after World War II. When it was played, I dance and my relatives follow me. The words of my honor song, like the songs of the Crow chiefs before me, reflect the pride we Crow people cherish to this day for our warrior heroes. Hybrid, you are a great soldier. Hybrid, you fought the mighty Germans. Hybrid, you counted coup on them. Hybrid, you are a great soldier. The end.